So specifically, what the NDAA does is it orders the Secretary of Commerce to create a program that provides tax money to a, quote, private entity, a consortium of private entities, or a consortium of public and private entities, unquote, to incentivize them to invest in creating, assembling, testing, packaging, and researching semiconductors in the United States. As for the companies eligible, foreign companies are welcome to apply for our tax money. The NDAA just says the money cannot be given to a, quote, foreign entity of concern, unquote, which is definitely not defined. And so when I say our government has been hijacked to serve the interests of multinationals, not Americans, this is exactly the type of shit that I'm talking about. Our tax money going to foreign companies, that's what makes this new law legal with the World Trade Organization, because it wouldn't create unfair perks for American companies. But as American taxpayers, if we're going to create a domestic industry, don't we want it to actually be domestic?
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 230th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. If this is your first time listening to Congressional Dish, you've picked a pretty good one. This is one of my main episodes. There are different kinds of episodes of Congressional Dish. There are main episodes, which is what everybody is excited for and paying for. And then there's the thank you episodes, because this is not a solo endeavor anymore. I did start this podcast back in 2012 because I wanted to know what Congress was doing with my money and in my name. And I don't really care about politics that much. I don't really care about Republicans versus Democrats and elections and all that shit. And yet that seems to be all we can really get when it comes to news about Congress. I wanted to know about the hearings. I wanted to know what was in the bills, what's in the laws, what are they doing? And so I was watching a lot of C-SPAN and I was reading the congressional record like a really weird person, and I was finding really interesting stuff that I wasn't finding anywhere else. It was like I would look in the congressional record and be like, oh my God, they just passed, some treaty attached to a funding law, and why is it that the news is not talking about this? And it turns out that that type of stuff happens all the time. And so I am creating the podcast that I couldn't find. And today, this is one of those episodes that I think is just so important, because what I did for this episode is I looked at the entire Coronabus, which funds all 12 sections of our government all at once that had COVID relief attached to it. So if you've heard of the Coronabus, you've probably heard of it because it was COVID relief right at the end of the Trump administration, but that was actually government funding. So I looked at that 5,593 page bill. And then I also looked at the National Defense Authorization Act for 2021. That is the bill that becomes law every single year that authorizes our war activities. And this one was about 1,000 pages and had some really interesting information about what our Defense Department is allowed to do when it comes to waging war with everyone else on Earth. And I would like to thank Mike Coverdale, who did help big time in getting some eyeballs on the NDAA. He sent me a whole bunch of notes that he took on the provisions that he found interesting, and that was really, really helpful. So thank you so much, Mike Coverdale. You were an assistant researcher on this episode, and you were very much appreciated. But there was so much in the National Defense Authorization Act that I'm unfortunately not going to be able to tell you about. Like, there are some under-the-radar regime change targets, not just Belarus. I just did a whole episode on that, but there's other ones in there. There's a whole section on money laundering provisions, and I figured, most of us are not laundering money. We're not criminals or trying to be criminals or really dealing with criminals. So that's some interesting stuff. If that in any way affects your life, look in the NDAA, which is actually not the appropriate place for that type of stuff. I call those provisions dingleberries, when they take stuff that doesn't really belong in a piece of legislation, but stick it there so it can hijack its way into law. So there's some money laundering provisions in the NDAA, and there is so much wasteful spending that I could bitch about for days and days and days. But what I decided to do for this episode today, the main story is, this is what I think we need to be aware of. This is the big story, and it's going to be today about China. And this episode is adding on to episodes that I've done in the last few years about our increasingly hostile relationship with China and the reasons that the rulers of the world are saying that our relationship is getting more and more hostile. So please listen to Congressional Dish 187. And I can't remember what we titled that one, but it's about China. That was from a couple of years ago. And then more recently, I did episode 218, Minerals Are the New Oil. That is also very much about China and really fits in to what I'm going to be talking about today. So those are kind of prerequisites to this episode. Although I do think that you'll be okay listening to this one on its own if you don't want to listen to those first. But like I said, this is a lot of work. This is one of the most important episodes that, I think all the episodes are important, especially because I don't know where the hell we would get this information if I wasn't doing it. But, 1,000 pages of war authorization, almost 6,000 pages of funding, who else is looking at this stuff? And so this is a listener-supported podcast so that I can tell you the things that I need to tell you without worrying about one corporate sponsor pulling all of my funding and me having to stop the show. Instead, I do a crowdfunding model. I get hired every day and I get fired every day. And it's a really good way for me to fund this because it means that I'm accountable to you. And there was someone who sent in a bit of feedback, and I'm sorry, I can't remember your name, but someone sent in some feedback saying that it's annoying that this is a one-way conversation. But the thing is, it's not a one-way thing. I know that you hear my voice, but all producers of Congressional Dish, all people that contribute to this show, any value that they receive, anybody that gives it back, you're allowed to have your voices heard. I make that quite easy for you, and not just by me, but by the entire internet on my bonus thank you episodes. We have two different kinds of producers. We have executive producers that get thanked at the end of main episodes. Those are people that contribute at least $535, $1 for every member of Congress, to Congressional Dish, and you get to have your name on an episode of your choice. The main episodes get about double the audience of the bonus episodes, but the bonus episodes still get a pretty large audience, and I read every single note from every single producer that wants to be heard. And as we heard in the last thank you episode, it's not always nice stuff. Some people pay to fire me in public. So anything that you want to say, you are welcome to do that in the thank you episodes. And all you have to do is contribute to Congressional Dish. Also, I do have a green room. This is producer only stuff. So like experimental episodes or uncut conversations that I don't want to air to the whole internet. Essentially, the green room is my private room, and only people who are invested in this show in a real way are invited. So if you provide money or time, this business model is based on a value exchange, and you can have access to the green room. The easiest way to do that is to pledge per episode on Patreon, but I do have a separate one for people that don't like Patreon for whatever reason. And right now, you should really be taking advantage of my laziness because I haven't set a price for this yet. So right now, and realistically, I won't have the time or energy to change any of this before July. But right now, if you contribute any amount, you're considered a founding donor of Congressional Dish because I'm just getting started. And so if you contribute anything, you can get an access code to the green room at whatever price feels fair to you. And so far, I haven't set any expiration dates on any of those access codes. There is some extra stuff for people that volunteer to participate in the value for value business model I'm running here. Thank you to every producer that does that. And if you appreciate the work and the information that you're getting here that I really don't think you're going to find anywhere else, please do pay for the show. You can find all of the options: PayPal, Patreon, Venmo, paper checks. We have a whole bunch of options. Bitcoin. We have all kinds of options. Anything you've asked me for, I have set up, and all of them are listed in every episode's show notes, either in your podcasting app or on congressionaldish.com. And seriously, I'm still doing this weird job after 8.5 years, and it would have been impossible without your support. So again, thank you to all producers of Congressional Dish. Okay, now let's talk about China. China is a country that has a very controlled government. It is not a democracy, and I'm not sure that it ever has been, but at least in my lifetime, it never has been. And in the 1990s, China was welcomed into the World Trade Organization. Now, the World Trade Organization is a part of a system that was really created after World War II. It's an economic system that is intended to become global eventually. That is the goal, and that is what our country has been working to do since World War II. That's really what we stand for in this world. And when China joined the World Trade Organization, multinationals got access to the Chinese humans who would work for almost nothing. And China became the sweatshop of the world. I think we're all pretty much aware of that. But what these multinationals did is once they got access to those humans that would work for slave wages, they left the countries requiring that humans be paid a moral wage, which devalued our American workforce's labor, which is why this country still has a minimum wage set at $7.25 an hour, which is less than $15,000 a year. In a big way, China joining the World Trade Organization resulted in a devaluation of our time and our effort. But there were benefits to this. There are benefits for the stockholder class. Because all of the money that these companies saved on workers when the multinationals were allowed to pay Chinese slave wages, they then passed out those savings to the people wealthy enough to own stock in those companies. And a lot of stockholders got very, very rich. And so did the Chinese government, which owns a lot of Chinese companies. Because one of the key tenets of this economic system that we intend to be global, governed by the World Trade Organization, is privatization. But the Chinese never followed the World Trade Organization rules. They didn't sell off their resources and companies to the multinationals. The Chinese government kept ownership, or at least partial ownership, over a lot of their most valuable companies. And as a result, the Chinese government's power and control over international commerce has grown to the point that the world trade system is feeling threatened. The Chinese economic system has the potential to compete with the World Trade Organization, not merge into it, as was the intent when China was welcomed into the system in the 1990s. Remember, the World Trade System, it's intended to be global, and so competition is not allowed. And so when I think of the big picture, the board I more and more have in my head when I think about this is the game Monopoly. And I think what is not understood very well in my country, at least it wasn't understood by me until years into producing this show for a living. But I don't think we Americans understand that the players in the game are not nations. This is a competition between systems, international economic systems. Here's David Helvey. He's the Acting Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Affairs at the Department of Defense, testifying to the House Committee on Armed Services on March 10th.
And the reality is that we're not asking nations to choose between the United States or China. In fact, we welcome and encourage all nations across the Indo-Pacific to maintain peaceful, productive relations with all of their neighbors, China included. Framing the strategic competition that we find ourselves in with China as a choice between us or China, or as a choice between nations, is really a false choice. The choice that our allies and our partners and everyone in the region faces is between supporting the existing international order, the existing system that's free and open. It's the system that we helped to create and that we've supported and that we believe has benefited everybody in the region, including China. And the alternative now that China is presenting, which is a closed system and a more authoritarian governance model. So it's a competition between systems, and it's a choice between systems. Do you want to choose a free and open system, or do you want to choose a closed and authoritarian one? And so we're only asking countries to do their part to uphold the international laws, rules, and norms which support their interests, which they've benefited from, and it helped to provide for security and prosperity for all of us. And so that's the ask that we've got of our allies and our partners.
When China was welcomed into the World Trade Organization in the 1990s, the expectation was that they would allow the multinationals to have access to their people, obviously, their workers willing to work for slave wages, and their resources, and we expected China to change their economic laws so that their government would have less control over business. But like I said before, China hasn't done that. The Chinese government has full or partial ownership over much of their economy, and in 2013, China's President Xi Jinping launched the One Belt, One Road initiative. Now, this project is a decades-long project focusing on creating so many things. First of all, infrastructure, transportation systems, so like trains and shipping lines for people and things. They're building ports and hospitals and airports and metro systems, and not just in China, but around the world. But these are infrastructure projects that China will have at least partial control over, or at least a lot of them they'll have partial control over. China is also building power grids and power sources to feed them. Not only dirty ones, like we seem to have a reputation for China here as being like, oh, they only use coal. They do use coal, but they also are big time investors in wind and solar. But basically what they're trying to do is own power grids and have those power sources. China's also investing in technology, specifically communication systems. So their companies Huawei and ZTE are discussed in Congress all the time, with our officials worried that China will be able to spy on the world too, the way our NSA has been proven to be allowed to spy on the world via backdoors that the multinational corporations installed for them in their systems. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Google a man named Edward Snowden. And then on top of that, and I think this is the biggest deal, China is also setting up a new financial system, a system that uses the Chinese system of credit and their currency, and that would challenge the dollar's dominance. Now, the Chinese system, as for what we should call it, well, the Council on Foreign Relations refers to the Chinese system as the BRI countries, as in Belt and Road Initiative countries. They call their own system, the one that we're paying taxes and sending our friends to war to die to implement, the rules-based international order. But I call it the World Trade System because the World Trade Organization appears to be the central enforcer of the rules. But the Belt and Road Initiative is a long-term strategy, and the more that I learn about it, the smarter it appears. The goal of these systems, both of them, is to get other countries to partner with them, because you can't have an international economic system without other countries. But instead of bombing partners into submission, they're building them into submission. So it's like, hey, you guys need some new bridges? Sure. We'll build you a new port too while we're at it, but just let us operate it for you for the next 100 years. And then all of a sudden, China has control over a port in like Peru. You know, so I guess the idea that I'm seeing them run with is that you catch more flies with honey, right? And so I can see why the world traders are concerned, because a lot of countries are signing contracts with China. And I also, I just kind of find it hilarious that the Chinese also stole a page right out of the World Traders Playbook, because the International Monetary Fund, which is a part of the World Trade System since the end of World War II, has given countries loans for enormous infrastructure projects that have made creating, moving, and selling their companies shit a lot easier. But they require these countries to pay these loans back in full with interest for these favors from the locals and from the taxpayers. And if the taxpayers can't pay the full amount back, which they usually can't, that's when their creditors, the IMF, make a bunch of demands. Now, the IMF likes to demand legal changes. They like to demand assimilation of that government into their rules-based system. You know, the IMF always wants reforms. Well, China is also in the loan sharking business now, but China's demands are usually less idealistic and more financial. They want to own your port for 99 years. You know, ruthless capitalists, those communists. And so you can see now, from the Asian countries to Europe to Africa to South America, all over the world, that China has the globe dotted with partner countries with infrastructure that they have some control over. China is also building themselves the ability to move items freely around the world with all this new infrastructure. And on top of that, they're securing themselves monopoly powers over the items that multinationals need to make their products. Specifically, they have really locked down the markets for minerals that are needed for all the tech gadgets that are increasingly dominating human life. So, for example, China has most of the supply of cobalt, lithium, and nickel, which are essential components for batteries and electric vehicles. We also recently learned during COVID about their dominance in the mask supply, because in the beginning of this, we were told not to wear masks because we didn't have enough for our healthcare workers, and we didn't have anyone. Well, we had a couple companies, and I actually had an episode about this. We had a few companies that could produce them here in America, but because their products were a little bit more expensive because they were made here and they were constructed by people who weren't paid slave wages, but were actually paid living wages. Most of the masks instead were manufactured in China. And when COVID hit, China kept the masks for themselves. So by dominating supply chains, you know, they have control over things that other humans all over the world need. And even if they don't own all of the components of a product, dominating even a portion of a supply chain can fuck over all the companies around the world that need it. And in this episode, the example I'm going to use will be semiconductors. But like I said, the big picture game is monopoly. The big picture game, as always, is economic. It's all about the money. But China is also building themselves the military infrastructure that they need to protect their economic investments. They actually call this the China Standards 2035. And what these are going to be is these are standards that promote civilian and military interoperability. The fear from the World Trade System with China Standards 2035 is that the potential overlap of military interoperability and Chinese government control of infrastructure projects could make foreign civilian facilities like ports available for China's military to use. So, for example, China signed a commercial lease for land in Djibouti through a Chinese bank. But then they developed a military base on the property after they had control of the land. And if Djibouti rings a bell, it's not just because that's a funny name, but it's probably because the U.S. government's only permanent military base in Africa, Camp Lemonnier, is also in Djibouti. So you can see why our military would be a little concerned. And a major concern is that China is also inventing new land. Actually, building new land in their own neighborhood by building islands in the South China Sea. And this is actually really fucked up. They're chopping up all the coral reefs in order to make these new islands. It's an environmental catastrophe. But the reason our military gives a shit is that on these new islands, they're sticking military bases on them. And so here's a discussion between Representative Joe Courtney of Connecticut and Admiral Philip Davidson. He's the U.S. Navy's commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. And they are talking about our military's concern about the new islands in the South China Sea on March 10th.
Admiral Davidson, on page 35 of your testimony, you set forth China's sort of brazen, repeated violations of the law of the sea treaty and mentioned the fact that 80 South China Sea geographic features were renamed with, I guess, Chinese names. Can you flesh that out a little bit, what that means in terms of, maritime territorial claims and the impact in terms of freedom of navigation?
Well, the Chinese are trying to basically impose Chinese national law on the international regime that provides for the freedom of navigation and freedom of the seas. We've spoken quite a bit about the Chinese use of lawfare. This is, one of the methodologies in which they do it. It's not just the naming or renaming of features that have had longstanding names in the region. It's the redefinition of what they might be because, rocks, islets, islands all have very specific navigational rights associated with them, as well as their continued militarization of the features that they built out early in the last decade. Their continued militarization is to, frankly, deter not only the United States, but truly cow all of our allies and partners in the region, and certainly the South China Sea claimants, from their absolute rights to operate and those rights that they enjoy for economic resource extraction, freedom of the seas, freedom of the airways, et cetera.
Well, thank you for that answer because, again, as you point out, this isn't just about sort of names. It's also about sort of territorial claims and what that means to the rules-based system that has been so successful over the last 75 years.
And so with China building up their military in a big way in the South China Sea, here's Admiral Davidson, again, the commander of our military in that region, telling the Senate what problem our military has. This testimony was given to the Senate on March 9th.
But the important factor here is time. It takes almost 3 weeks to respond from the west coast of the United States and 17 days to respond from Alaska to get all the way to the first island chain and to conduct operations within the second island chain.
I don't know why that got off, but it should have said second island chain. Anyway, so that's what they're concerned about. They're concerned about China being able to control their own neighborhood and our inability to get there quick enough to do anything about it. And so, to respond to that, in the last 5 years, I can tell you that I've known of at least 2 initiatives that have been created to pre-position our fighters for war in China's neighborhood. The first time that I saw one was in 2016 in the NDAA. This authorized $50 million to be spent on the now called Indo-Pacific Maritime Security Initiative, which provides military equipment and training to Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and gives money to Brunei, Singapore, Taiwan, and India. And that was not the starting point for this initiative. It's been expanded to that since its creation, and its authority doesn't end until 2025. Then fast forward to the Trump years in 2018. In that NDAA, they authorized a new initiative. They authorized the now called Indo-Pacific Stability Initiative, which builds new infrastructure, pre-positions equipment and weapons for war, and performs military training and exercises with allies. This initiative is funded with transfer authorities, which means I don't really know how much money is going into this. And these agencies have all kinds of authorities to move money around, which is why the Defense Department in particular has proven itself to be literally impossible to audit. They tried. I'm using that word literally on purpose. They tried to audit it. But the best auditors in the world couldn't do it. They just simply had to give up. And so funding for this initiative is likely substantial. But because it's funded with transfer authorities, I have no way to even give you a ballpark number for it, which is disturbing. Also, this one has expanded since its creation too. It's getting bigger, not smaller, and there's no end date for this authority. That same year, on New Year's Eve 2018, then President Donald Trump also signed the Asia Reassurance Initiative into law. This was one of the last acts of the fully Republican-controlled government when they had control of the House, Senate, and the White House. Not that it really mattered, since this bill that became law passed the Senate by unanimous consent and by a voice vote in the House, which means it was so uncontroversial that neither branch of Congress even bothered to hold real votes on it. But this law says that the goal is to, quote, counter China's influence to undermine the international system, unquote. And it makes our official U.S. policy for the region to pursue freedom of navigation under international law. We also expand our security and defense cooperation with allies and partners. We want to, quote, develop and grow the economy through private sector partnerships between the United States and Indo-Pacific partners, unquote. It's also our policy to pursue trade agreements and, quote, build a network of partners in the Indo-Pacific committed to free markets, unquote. And then we also, quote, promote American prosperity and economic interests by advancing economic growth and development of a rules-based Indo-Pacific economic community, unquote. So we want to expand the economic system our government promotes further into China's neighborhood. That's the purpose of the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act of 2018. And we're going to do that by pushing for, quote, full implementation of the World Trade Organization's Trade Facilitation Agreement by Indo-Pacific countries, unquote. And to do this, Congress authorized, quote, such sums as may be necessary, unquote, which is unlimited funding, for the president to produce a, quote, trade facilitation strategy, unquote, which helps multinationals operate in China's neighborhood. Now, when it comes to actual money, this law authorized $210 million per year from 2019 through 2025, so that's over $1 billion in total, to, quote, promote democracy, strengthen civil society, etc., unquote, in the Indo-Pacific region, so China's neighborhood. And this money, this over $1 billion, can be used to promote democracy and the, quote, rule of law, unquote. I'll let you guess which laws they're talking about, inside of China. So basically, we have authorized over $1 billion to interfere in the politics of the Chinese government and try to switch them over to democracy, whatever that word actually means when we're in the country doing it. But let's just note the priorities, okay? This gave unlimited funding, no caps whatsoever, for implementing the World Trade Organization that helps multinationals. But we have $1 billion to try to flip China towards being a democracy. So, priorities, unlimited versus $1 billion. We care more about the economic stuff. There's also another batch of money in here for all of the noble-sounding things like human rights and blah, blah, blah. But also, this big batch of money can go towards, quote, encouraging responsible natural resource management in partner countries, which is closely aligned with economic growth, unquote. We can also spend our money on intelligence, which is spying, foreign military financing, which is buying shit for other countries' military. We can spend our money on foreign military education and training, so basically building them new militaries. We can spend our money on military and Coast Guard training exercises, cooperating with Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. And we also have multilateral engagements with Japan, Australia, and India. All of this is funded with $1.5 billion per year from 2019 through 2023, which is $7.5 billion of your tax money in total. And so we're building our military and partnerships bit by bit. It started with a little initiative in 2016, and then there was a big increase with 2 initiatives in 2018. And I just want to take a second to marinate on the name of that second one, the Asia Reassurance Initiative. I just want you to remember that after Obama-Biden helped with the switcheroo of the government of Ukraine from a Russia-partnered one to a World Trade System-partnered one in 2014, our military created the European Reassurance Initiative, which a few years later was expanded and renamed the European Deterrence Initiative. It went from we're just here to reassure you to now we're here to deter bad Russia. So this is pretty much the same thing, the Asia Reassurance Initiative. This is the same starting point with this almost the same exact name. Which brings me to 2021. Now, first of all, the Coronabus, which is the government funding law, appropriates almost the full amount, $1.482 billion for the State Department to implement the Asia Reassurance Initiative of 2018 provisions. But on top of that, the Coronabus provides the State Department a new additional money bucket with at least $300 million in it for a countering Chinese influence fund, which might give you some deja vu too, because they also had a countering Russian influence fund since 2017. In 2021, the Countering Russia Fund is getting a little bit less money than the China one, which is another sign of shifting priorities. But even as I say that out loud, both of these are funded with minimums. So in 2021, we're spending at least $290 million to counter Russia and at least $300 million to counter China. There is no legal cap. Those are minimums. There's no cap on how much money can be put in the funds. And again, they're funded with transfer authorities, which allows a lot of money to be moved around in ways that are hard, if not impossible, for me to track. But even with those military initiatives and new State Department money buckets, the military is concerned that it won't be enough. Here's Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi speaking to Admiral Philip Davidson, who again is the commander of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. They're having this conversation in Congress on March 9th.
With regard to the projected 2025, it shows that at that point, China will have 3 aircraft carriers to our 1 in the region. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And then with regard to amphibious assault ships, it's projected in 2025 they will have 6 to our 2.
Yes, sir.
And then with regard to modern multi-warfare combatant ships, 54 to our 6. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And what is the significance of that last figure, Admiral?
Really, the 3 charts work together, Senator. One, to show the change in capability and capacity that the Chinese have undertaken during the course of the 21st century, and the relatively static nature of our own forward positioned forces. As I described, our effort to do a deterrence, to sustain a deterrence posture in the region is so important on our ability to respond in time. And without question, as an old novel in the 70s used to say, the importance of U.S. presence forward is incredibly important. Perfect speed is being there. And it's to show that if we don't make changes in our posture forward, that it will demonstrate that the Chinese have much greater capacity than we have.
And so the 2021 NDAA does something about it. Here's Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi again, but this time he's reading the words of the chair of the Senate Committee on Armed Services, Senator Jim Imhoff of Oklahoma, who wasn't at the March 9th hearing for some reason.
As China invested in military capabilities, many Americans naively assumed that China's entry into the WTO and the global integration of its economy would somehow make the Chinese Communist Party more friendly and open to the West. The result now is America's military advantage and the credibility of our deterrent is eroding. That is why the 2021 NDAA was the toughest bill on China ever, with several national security committees involved. And that is specifically why this committee put the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, or PDI, into last year's NDAA to stop aggression from the Chinese Communist Party.
The Pacific Deterrence Initiative. Once again, we're shifting from just reassurance, we're just here to reassure our friends, to deterrence. And so specifically, the 2021 NDAA requires the Secretary of Defense to create this new Pacific Deterrence Initiative to build up our military presence west of the international dateline. Its purpose is to strengthen the presence of the U.S. Armed Forces in China's neighborhood. We're going to pre-position equipment, weapons, and fuel. We're going to perform exercises, training, and experiments with our partners. And we're going to build the militaries of allies and partners and enhance cooperation with them. And the 2021 NDAA authorizes over $2.2 billion this year to do this. And now that this has been law for a few months, the discussion in Congress is clearly already going towards expansion. Here's Senator Wicker again reading Chairman Inhofe's statement in the March 9th hearing.
In Europe, we've made a lot of progress on posture through the European Defense Initiative.
It's the European Deterrence Initiative, but, whatever. Carry on.
EDI, by investing over $20 billion in the last 5 years. We need to apply a similar level of focus, effort, and resources to our posture in the Pacific through PDI. We know we need advanced capabilities like hypersonics and AI, but that is not enough. It is clear we need the right posture to ensure our forces can be in the right place at the right time with the right stuff. This is what PDI was designed to accomplish.
And to do that for 2022, the military is requesting a check more than twice the amount provided this year. Here's Admiral Davidson.
I think the Pacific Deterrence Initiative funded in FY21 for about $2.2 billion was a good first start. I recognize that the committee has put a cap on $5.5 billion on the fund going forward.
And what do they want the additional money for? Here's Senator Mazie Hirano of Hawaii speaking to Admiral Davidson.
I noticed that you significantly increased the requested amount from last year's PDI report to this year's report to strengthen our allies and partners over the next 5 years in the region, from over $300 million to about $2.8 billion. Can you discuss your rationale for this significant increase and what that additional funding is intended to do, or where will it go?
Well, you highlighted the key aspects, ma'am. It's to enhance and make improvements in our joint exercise program. And that's principally because not only the United States, but our key allies and partners, Japan, Korea, Australia, as just 3 examples, are buying important capabilities that match ours. Integrated air and missile defense, for example, 5th-generation fighters like the F-35. They're being actually delivered in the theater. We've got to advance our exercise capabilities, our exercise program in a way that allows us to exercise those capabilities deliberately.
So our partners are getting F-35s. The F-35 are fighter jets that we taxpayers have invested $1.6 trillion into creating. And after all that money, these jets still can't do all the fancy shit that they were supposed to do. And in attempting to do all that fancy shit, they also have failed to perform their original intent, which was to be a lightweight aircraft. Each one of these F-35 bitches are 25 tons. And so the military now wants even more new planes since the F-35s are not at all what they were paying for. Now, more than anything, when you look at the F-35 development program, this has been a project that has funneled our tax money to Lockheed Martin. In building the F-35, they got cost-plus fee contracts, which means that we pay all the costs, and then they get a guaranteed fee. They get guaranteed profits. And so they get profits regardless of their job performance, which I think goes a long way towards explaining why the damn things still don't work properly. It's because they don't have to for Lockheed stockholders to get paid. And now Lockheed Martin is pushing for a 5-year contract, of course paid for with our tax money, which would supply parts to maintain 80% of the whole world's existing F-35s, which, as you just heard, we are encouraging our partner countries to spend their citizens' tax money on these lemons. And let's be real, we have foreign military financing, which means that we are gifting them our tax money to buy these too. But basically, follow the money here. We work all day, every day, and forcibly invest some of our hard-earned money into the collective money pot called the government, which is supposed to maintain the basics of our society for the benefit of us all. But in reality, a huge scoop from that money bucket funds military projects like the F-35. our taxes paid to do the research and development for the planes. And then we bought the planes we paid to invent. Then we handed out the planes. We're still handing out the planes and the parts and the equipment and God only knows what else in all of these initiatives that give military gifts to our partner countries. Then the citizens of those countries get to pay Lockheed and Lockheed's preferred subcontractors to maintain the planes, which have so many expensive, profitable parts. And to facilitate this exactly, the 2021 NDAA also doubles the amount of money allowed to be spent on longer-term contracts, like the 5-year contract that Lockheed Martin has been lobbying for the F-35. Their money for the long-term contracts are going to double from $574 million to over $1 billion. And by the way, Lockheed Martin spent almost $13 million lobbying Congress in 2020 alone when the NDAA was being written. And people within Lockheed Martin spent almost $7 million in direct donations to candidates and the big two political parties during the 2020 election. But I'm sure it's just a coincidence that they got $500 million in contracts for a project that has failed to do what it was supposed to do in this NDAA. I'm sure that's all a coincidence. But if it's not a coincidence, $20 million in donations and lobbying in return for $500 million, it's an excellent return on investment. In addition to handing out F-35s like they're chiclets in Mexico, there is also another Lockheed Martin contract that is very likely to grow, I found out in researching this episode. Lockheed Martin, turns out, is the manufacturer and its shareholders are the profiters from the Aegis Ashore missile defense system, which can be placed on ships and on land. And so I'm sure the Lockheed Martin stockholders, especially executives with lots of the stock, were thrilled to hear this on March 10th in the House Committee on Armed Services. And in this clip, which is Admiral Davidson, you're going to hear him say PRC. That stands for People's Republic of China, which is China's full name.
The threat as it's developed in the Western Pacific has moved in a way in which we need to have better integrated air and missile defense capability on Guam in order to defend it. What you have in place right now is THAAD radar, which only has a 120-degree wide look at threats in the region, and in fact, it's oriented on North Korea. And it's meant to defend against a rogue shot of intermediate range from North Korea. We supplement that with an Aegis destroyer. As we look at the expanse of Chinese weapon systems and their employment of air and maritime forces in the region, we need a 360-degree defense now of Guam. And it must be able to meet the ballistic missile threat that can come from PRC land as well as PRC ships. But it also should meet the 360-degree threat around Guam that comes from circumnavigations of Guam by PRC naval assets, including submarines that could shoot land attack cruise missiles, for example, as well as bomber approaches and its ability to shoot land attack cruise missiles as well. We have to be able to defend against all those threats. Aegis Ashore is a proven technology that you have today at sea, and you have it ashore in Romania and Poland to help in the defense of Europe. That system would enable all the capabilities that you have today and begin to meet the threats in the future. As China develops hypersonic weapons during the course of this decade, clearly there's going to be a need to have space sensing associated with that. You're still going to have an interceptor to meet the threat. In my view, you rectify that by bridging Aegis Ashore with our space capability that is to come.
Great.
So more missile defense for Guam. But what I learned by watching these hearings and reading the NDAA is that their bigger concern is another island, the island known as Taiwan. Here's Representative Scott DesJarlais of Iowa speaking to Admiral Philip Davidson in the hearing on March 10th.
Admiral Davidson, what do you consider the most likely potential target of Chinese aggression or military action in the next 5 to 10 years?
Given what they've said both publicly and over time, and certainly during the tenure of Chairman Xi Jinping, I would say Taiwan is the first.
And why is he worried about this?
I worry that they're accelerating their ambitions to supplant the United States and our leadership role in the rules-based international order, which they've long said that they want to do that by 2050. I'm worried about them moving that target closer. Taiwan is clearly one of their ambitions before that, and I think the threat is manifest during this decade, in fact, in the next 6 years.
Now, Taiwan has a weird history and role in this world. Taiwan is an island off of mainland China, and Taiwan's official name is the Republic of China. Because in 1949, the government now ruling Taiwan lost a civil war to the Communist Party of China. They were both fighting to be the rulers of China. But despite losing until the 1970s, Taiwan's government insisted that it was the real government of all of China. In 1971, the United Nations said nah, and said that the government of China, the People's Republic of China, was the government of China. And then the United Nations kicked out the representatives from Taiwan. Taiwan's government still isn't a part of the United Nations today. Then a few years later, in 1979, both the government of China, the real one, and the government of Taiwan was insisting that the United States could only have official diplomatic relations with one of them. And so President Carter established a relationship between our country and the Chinese government. The government of China wants the whole world to say that Taiwan is a part of China and therefore under their control. This is called the One China principle, and China has never given up on it. And so since the late 1970s, our diplomatic relationship with Taiwan has been unofficial, even though we've sent Taiwan tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons in the decades since. It's one of the strangest relationships we have with another country, to on one hand refuse to call it an actual country, and then funnel weapons to it with our other hand to protect its sovereignty. But viewing our own government as basically a taxpayer-funded lobbying organization for multinational corporations, our government doesn't want Taiwan gobbled up by Big Daddy China. Because Taiwan, as of 2017, is our 10th largest trading partner, and Taiwan buys the second largest amount of weapons from the weapons manufacturers whose interests we all pay taxes to serve. So we have to walk this tightrope as a nation, as a government, of trying to stay cool with China by saying Taiwan is theirs, but at the same time letting Taiwan determine its own economic policies because they're partnered with our companies. This militarily strategically important island leans more towards the World Trade System than whatever the hell China's economic system is. The BRI system, I guess, is what we're calling it. But this weird-ass policy was made official by the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979 and in 6 communiques issued between 1972 and 1982. And there's some controversy about the interpretation, but it seems clear to me that we did officially say that Taiwan is a part of China, but that we're going to sell Taiwan weapons via our unofficial relationship with the island. Now, the NDAA in 2021 says that those laws and promises remain, quote, the foundation for the United States-Taiwan relations, unquote. But what I found interesting is that in the 1982 assurances from Reagan, which are apparently still legit and the foundation for our relations, well, the 1982 communiques said that we would gradually reduce our sale of weapons to Taiwan over time, but we set no end date. And we certainly have not reduced weapon sales to Taiwan. And if the NDAA for 2021 is to be believed, we have no intention to do so, because the NDAA for 2021 says it's U.S. policy to continue selling weapons to Taiwan, including weapons for air defense, undersea warfare, intelligence, surveillance, anti-armor, anti-ship, and coastal defense systems. And it's also U.S. policy to perform joint military exercises with Taiwan. So no reduction on the horizon, despite that being our official policy. And the Chinese, for their part, openly say that they reserve the right to use force to take control of Taiwan if it can't be done peacefully. And we've kind of been seeing this happen in Hong Kong in the last year, which is another part of China that hasn't really been operating as a part of China. It's been doing its own governing thing for decades. But in the past year, China, with the passage of a new security law giving it policing rights over Hong Kong, well, China has been exerting a lot more control with physical force than it has, at least in my lifetime. And I thought that Hong Kong was independent and that this was a really crazy dick move by China when I first heard about it. But after researching and learning things, I discovered that Hong Kong has never been independent of China. In 1984, the United Kingdom and China signed a treaty determining the future of Hong Kong, a future that involved the transfer of Hong Kong to China, and that transfer was actually completed in 1997. In the 1984 treaty, however, China did promise to allow Hong Kong to operate fairly independently for 50 years, which would be until July of 2047. The Chinese have referred to their relationship with Hong Kong as, quote, one country, two systems, unquote. But it appears that China might be speeding up that timeline. And I have no idea what's legal under that treaty. But because it was news to me, I feel like the fact that China was eventually getting full control of Hong Kong as written in a United Nations approved treaty, I feel like that might be news to other Americans too. But as far as the 2021 NDAA is concerned, all it said about Hong Kong is that crime control items can't be exported to the police in Hong Kong. But Taiwan is watching the Hong Kong situation closely. Obviously. Because to see the other sort of independent part of China lose its autonomy in the last year, let's just say that I don't think Taiwan's fears about aggression from China are unfounded. And Taiwan's government, for their part, which in the past has embraced the ambiguity on its independence, well, this current government is doubling down on its position of independence as well. The current government is clear that it's not in agreement with the idea that it's part of China. Because after her most recent re-election, Taiwan's President Tsai said, quote, we don't have a need to declare ourselves an independent state. We are an independent country already, unquote. And so China is clearly showing more aggression towards the sort of independent parts of it that have partnered big time with multinational corporations. And Taiwan is indicating that it's had enough of China's shit. And our military, and those close to it, when they look at this situation, they think that the threat of an actual war over Taiwan seems real. So here's Donald Trump, President Trump's second national security advisor, Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster, who is now a current board member of the International Republican Institute. Well, here he is testifying to the Senate on March 2nd.
It's the most significant flashpoint now that could lead to a large-scale war is Taiwan. And I think that has to do with really Xi Jinping's belief that he has a fleeting window of opportunity that's closing, and he wants to, in his view, make China whole again. You see this with the extension of the party's repressive arm into Hong Kong and this horrible genocidal campaign in Xinjiang. Taiwan is the next big prize. And so I think what we have to be able to do is have forward position capable forces, because what Xi Jinping wants to do with what would be the largest land grab, so to speak, in history, if he succeeds in the South China Sea, is to weaponize the South China Sea and just make it too difficult for us to be able to employ forces inside of that inner island chain.
And so, because Taiwan is important to us economically, it's a part of our system, not really China's, in its current governmental form, and militarily by being an island that we have influence over right off of China's border. The NDAA 2021 says it's U.S. policy to, quote, resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion that would jeopardize the security or the social or economic system of the people of Taiwan, unquote. And so when I look at this situation as a whole, we have a big military buildup, plus an official policy to resist any form of coercion that could change the economic system, and that equals maybe war. And as far as the rest of the world is concerned, ever since Taiwan was booted from the United Nations in 1971, it's been existing in a sort of diplomatic no man's land. And China's trying to keep it that way by using its leverage with the countries of the world to keep Taiwan isolated from the international community. So, for example, China recently blocked the ability of Taiwan's representatives to attend the World Health Assembly meetings, even though Taiwan had been attending them for 7 years before COVID. Which brings me to the Taiwan Assurance Act of 2020. This is a bill that is now law because it was buried over 5,000 pages deep in the Coronabus. And it's also another one of those bills that's not listed in the table of contents. Unless you look through all the pages, you don't even know it's there. Classic Dingleberry. Well, this new law makes it U.S. policy to advocate for Taiwan's inclusion in international organizations that don't require statehood, including the United Nations, the World Health Assembly, and others, which is an action that does not match our words to China, that we officially consider Taiwan to be a part of China. That is what we've said to them. And so this action, hidden in a law, implies that Taiwan is its own thing since its representative in those organizations would not be China. And the Biden administration is on board with implementing this as our policy. Here's Secretary of State Antony Blinken during his confirmation hearing on January 19th.
There's been a strong and long bipartisan commitment to Taiwan, the Taiwan Relations Act, also the communiques with China. And part of that commitment is making sure that Taiwan have the ability to defend itself against aggression. And that is a commitment that will absolutely endure in a Biden administration. We will make sure that Taiwan has the ability to do that. I'd also like to see Taiwan playing a greater role around the world, including in international organizations. When those organizations don't require the status of a country to be a member, they should become members. When it does, there are other ways that they can participate.
And so I'm calling it. Our actions indicate that we are on team Taiwan is independent, regardless of what we say about being neutral. We're clearly not. You know, when I look at everything put together, it seems clear to me that Taiwan's assimilation into China will not be allowed. But just in case this Taiwan thing doesn't go in our favor and we don't follow through with all of our tough talk about war, the NDAA for 2021 does start allocating our tax money to prop up an industry that relies very heavily on Taiwan, which is the semiconductor industry. Now, I'm not even going to pretend to really understand what a semiconductor is. My engineer husband, Joe, explained it to me twice over the last 2 days, and it's very clear that I just don't care enough to retain the information that he gave me. But what I do understand, which I think is all I really need to understand, is that semiconductors are needed to make a lot of computer-based technology work. Now, the problem with semiconductors is that production of them has been outsourced to the point that we don't manufacture nearly enough of them on our soil anymore, a lot like the masks situation. So we don't manufacture enough of them here in America to support the needs of the tech companies that we pay taxes to serve, the multinationals that call themselves American. The few companies that do make semiconductors domestically, including Intel and Texas Instruments, they don't have enough factories to compete with Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing and Samsung. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing and Samsung are both thinking about building manufacturing plants in the United States. They're specifically looking to build one in Arizona and one in Texas. But they want subsidies. They want to either be given bunches of our tax money or they want to get out of paying taxes into our system before they do it. Now, when it comes to giving subsidies, an Information Technology and Innovation Foundation report, and that's a think tank, so take that for what it is. But they put out a report that says that the U.S. offers fewer corporate tax gifts compared to other countries. We were ranked 24th out of the 34 countries listed. And China's incentives are 2.5 times more generous than those offered in the United States, which is one of the things that the World Trade System people are pissed about. They constantly say that China uses tax money or, whatever money China has to help its industries compete. They call it unfair trading practices. And I don't know, maybe it is, but the NDAA authorizes our government to do the same damn thing, to use our tax money to help companies. The only difference is that the companies we're going to subsidize are private, stock market serving companies instead of companies co-owned by any government, co-owned by the citizens of any nation. So, specifically, what the NDAA does is it orders the Secretary of Commerce to create a program that provides tax money to a, quote, private entity, a consortium of private entities, or a consortium of public and private entities, unquote, to incentivize them to invest in creating, assembling, testing, packaging, and researching semiconductors in the United States. As for the companies eligible, foreign companies are welcome to apply for our tax money. The NDAA just says the money cannot be given to a, quote, foreign entity of concern, unquote, which is definitely not defined. And so when I say our government has been hijacked to serve the interests of multinationals, not Americans, this is exactly the type of shit that I'm talking about. Our tax money going to foreign companies, that's what makes this new law legal with the World Trade Organization, because it wouldn't create unfair perks for American companies. But as American taxpayers, if we're going to create a domestic industry, don't we want it to actually be domestic? That's an actual question. I don't really know how I feel about this, but just looking at that dynamic of our tax money going to foreign companies, even if they do build it in Arizona or Texas. What? But regardless, as for how much of our tax money can be passed out to these multinationals, There's no overall limit. But to get an idea of what kind of numbers we're looking at here, it says that tax money for any individual project is capped at $3 billion. But that limit can be waived with the recommendation of the Defense Secretary, the Director of National Intelligence, and the President. And so we're definitely measuring this in the many billions of our tax dollars going to these companies. But our tax money hasn't actually been handed out yet. This is an authorization. And I looked, and there's no funding that was provided in the NDAA or Coronabus for this. The funding is likely going to come after the Secretary of Commerce finishes designing the program, using the part of the NDAA that authorizes the Secretary of the Treasury to create a, quote, multilateral semiconductor security fund, unquote, which would be used to create semiconductor supply chains. The Secretary of State is going to be allowed to use the money in the fund to give to foreign governments, to fund companies that support the semiconductor industry there, too, on the condition that these countries enact restrictions on exports to China. And if the Secretary of State chooses to funnel our tax money to foreign governments, the Secretary of State is encouraged, but not required, to establish transparency requirements for what they do with our tax money. And it says the Secretary of State is encouraged to, quote, promote harmonized treatment and verification processes, unquote, for stuff being sent to countries considered national security risks. What the hell kind of not requirement garbage is that? Promote harmonized treatment? First of all, promote is not require. And treatment, that should be defined. You know, sending the national security threat country a gift basket is a treatment. Prohibiting tax money to flow to them is another treatment. And so this effectively provides no protection of our tax money at all. And how much of our tax money gets funneled to the multinationals that make semiconductors to bribe them into making them here or in partner countries with no requirements that the semiconductors actually get sold to the companies that we're doing this for or to our government? How much of our tax money will actually be allocated to this? We don't know. They're still figuring that out now. So when it comes to the amount of money, though, the Semiconductor Industry Association is pushing for Congress to dingleberry tens of billions of dollars for them into the upcoming infrastructure bill, according to David Isaacs, who's the Vice President of Government Affairs, as in the Vice President of Lobbying at that lobbying organization. And Congress is pushing the Biden administration to find money for this even before that infrastructure bill can become law, if it becomes law. And this is bipartisan. So Senators John Cornyn, who is a Republican from Texas, and Mark Warner, a Virginia Democrat, they co-wrote a letter in February to the Biden administration asking Biden to do what they have to do to get funding secured to implement these provisions. And notably, the new Senate Majority Leader, who is a Democrat, Chuck Schumer, he's the top guy in the Senate, and he also signed that letter. So this is one of those things I would love to hear from producers about your opinions on this, because I think you can tell from my tone that just on its face, taking billions and billions and billions of our tax money and creating an industry that goes to foreign countries and foreign companies, I don't know what to make of that. Is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? How does this actually serve us? Does it serve us? Am I missing something? I really want to hear from you guys because I'm torn on this, but my instinct is to go, what in the actual fuck are we doing? This seems like a favor to an industry. What feels right to me is if we were going to spend, as it seems we are, tens of billions of dollars in building an industry, I would at least want that industry to, in some way, be American. I would want a requirement that Americans be hired. I would want a requirement that we get discounts on the products that it makes. Something in return for our tax money, instead of all this tax money going just to build an industry so it's not connected to China. Like, I don't know what our benefit is. And so that's what I really want to hear from you guys about. How do you see this? Because I don't know where I land on this. I don't know. So anyway, in addition to funneling our tax money to companies and governments around the world to create a semiconductor industry that isn't threatened if China gobbles up Taiwan, the 2021 NDAA also puts in some technology requirements for our own military that I'm shocked were not in place already. So one of the things it says beginning on January 1st, 2023, so there's still a window there, the Defense Department's going to be prohibited from buying printed circuit boards that are either fully or partially manufactured in North Korea, China, Russia, or Iran. So it does seem pretty wise to not have critical components of our weapon systems produced in the countries most likely to be targets of those weapons. And the Secretary of Defense also has the ability to waive these restrictions if he wants to, but it's just one of those, like, why would he want to? Why do we want to do that? It's another situation where, like, we have outsourced ourselves to the point of it being dangerous and stupid. So by 2023, at least that one seems like it'll be fixed. And then finally, the Coronabus prohibits NASA, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the National Space Council from working with, contracting from, and coordinating, quote, in any way with China or any Chinese-owned company, unquote, unless the activities are specifically authorized by a law enacted after the Coronabus. And it says that this can be waived if those agencies consult with the FBI and find that the cooperation would, quote, pose no risk of resulting in the transfer of technology, data, or other information with national security or economic security implications to China or a Chinese-owned company, unquote, which tells me that they are really concerned and want to keep our space stuff separate from the Chinese. And to get an idea of why Congress felt this provision necessary, here's a new senator. This is Mark Kelly of Arizona. Now, Mark Kelly has been famous for a while because he is Representative Gabby Giffords' husband. She was the one that was shot in the face in Tucson, Arizona, when she was doing a campaign event at a Safeway. This is her husband, but Mark Kelly is also quite famous for also being an astronaut. And so now we have an astronaut in the Senate, and that astronaut is speaking to Admiral Davidson here in this clip from March 9th.
A couple questions here about command and control and communications. And we rely heavily on satellites to do that. And in January of 2007, China conducted an anti-satellite test against one of their own non-operational weather satellites with a kinetic kill vehicle. And it's been reported that in the years since, China has an operational capability that can attack satellites in low Earth orbit, and that they're developing a capability that goes all the way out to geosynchronous orbit. So how does this affect the strategic balance of power in the region from your perspective?
Thanks for that, Senator. Yes, both China and Russia have demonstrated capability to disrupt satellites, testing capabilities on their own assets in the past, as you've articulated. It clearly, I think, demonstrates that space, which we've long considered a domain in which would be unthreatened for the United States, the potential is there actually for it to be threatened. We have to build resiliency into our space apparatus. That happens with other space assets. It happens with creating airborne and other terrestrial alternatives to fulfill that. And it changes the calculus in space as well. We have to recognize that, again, this goes back to some earlier comments I made about deterrent theory. We're not going to be able to play defense alone in this particular regard. If we can't demonstrate to others that their capabilities in space might be at risk, then we run the risk of a deterrence failure. That said, the space layer is critically important to how we sense in the strategic nuclear deterrent, how we communicate across the joint force, and even how we sense and distribute information to the conventional forces as well.
Furthering that idea that China and Russia are threatening our dominance of space, just a few weeks ago in mid-March, China and Russia agreed to work together to build a research station on the moon. And so the economic Cold War with these countries is expanding to the point that it's literally out of this world. So the bottom line, the NDAA and the Coronabus take aim at China, for sure, economically and militarily. But again, this really isn't about China, the country. It's bigger than that. It's about the economic systems as part of that bigger game, the monopoly game. In that game, the World Trade System is trying to collect countries. The other countries are the houses and hotels on the board. And to that end, there was a lot more in the NDAA and the Coronabus. And I wish I had the time and the resources and the staff to jump down all the rabbit holes. I'm telling you, I could work on these two bills for the rest of the year and not run out of stories to tell. And so even though I focused today on the China stuff, because that seemed to be the main story, but I put my outline of the key war-related provisions from the NDAA and the Coronabus in the show notes for you. There's a lot more than what I talked about today, and there's also a lot more sound clips. The transcripts of those are in the show notes for you too. And so I'm kind of done with the China stuff here, and I'm not going to get into the details of any of this today, but there are a few more things I just want to put on your radar, even though they're going to be so incomplete. I have three. First up, following up on my Venezuela episodes, which those episodes were about the dumbest coup of all time, where the Trump administration basically tried to say that the actual president of Venezuela, who is Nicolas Maduro, the Trump administration and its partner countries basically said, he's not the president anymore. Another guy that no one elected president named Juan Guaido is the president. It was absolutely bonkers and it didn't work. And now Juan Guaido isn't even in the position that he was in back then that kind of gave him the maybe authority to make the claim at the presidency. So Juan Guaido, let's just make this clear, just is not the president of Venezuela. And yet, here's our new Secretary of State at his confirmation hearing answering a question of one of the dumbass coup's most enthusiastic cheerleaders, Senator Marco Rubio of Florida.
Is it your view that that our stance towards Venezuela should change in essence, that we should no longer recognize Juan Guaido and enter into negotiations with Maduro?
No, it is not. I very much agree with you, Senator. First of all, with regard to a number of the steps that were taken toward Venezuela in recent years, including recognizing Mr. Guaido, recognizing the National Assembly as the only democratically elected institution in Venezuela, seeking to increase pressure on the regime led by a brutal dictator in Maduro.
And so Venezuela is still a regime change target. Republican President Trump, Democrat President Biden, it doesn't matter. They all want to flip the government of the country with the most oil resources in the world. They want that on Team World Trade. Then there's Sudan. And this one, I don't know nearly enough about Sudan, but it was all over the NDAA. And so here's Paula Debryansky. She's the former Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs for the George W. Bush administration. And she's a current high-ranking official at the Atlantic Council. Well, here she is testifying to the Senate on March 10th. And I think in the battle of the systems, this gives a pretty good big picture clue as to why we gave a single about Sudan.
Russia and China have expanded investments in Africa as well. In 2003, annual Chinese direct investment in Africa was just $75 million. But by 2009, it reached $2.7 billion. Through its One Belt, One Road initiative, China is offering fragile democracies in Africa new rail lines, highways, and other infrastructure projects. African nations are finding that these projects have left them with massive debt and a lack of control. Russia is also increasing its investments in Africa, too, especially its military presence. It's striving to create a Red Sea naval logistics facility in Sudan.
And here's Peter Bayar-Ajak. He is a fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy. I've done an entire episode on the National Endowment for Democracy. You have to listen to that because it's an arm of the State Department that basically functions for regime changes, amongst a few other things, but basically regime changes. And this guy is a, quote, civil society leader, unquote, from South Sudan, testifying to Congress in that same hearing on March 10th in the Senate.
The United States needs to send a clear message to Kiir that his repression of our people will no longer be tolerated, nor any further delay of elections. They should sanction perpetrators of gross human rights violations like Kuch, while urging the African Union to urgently set up the hybrid court on South Sudan to end impunity. If Kiir doesn't hold election on time, his already illegitimate regime will have expired. Since he was never elected by our people, this would necessitate a new political paradigm to ensure a successful transition to democracy. Despite severe repression, our people made it clear in the recently concluded national dialogue that Kiir and Machar must exit the political scene. I hope the United States, this committee, will stand with our people.
Which sounds regime-changing to me. And in that respect, the NDAA also included a dingleberry bill called the Sudan Democratic Transition Accountability and Fiscal Transparency Act of 2020. This part of the NDAA makes it U.S. policy to, among other things, support a, quote, political transition in Sudan, unquote, and promote, quote, economic reform, private sector engagement, unquote, and, quote, catalyzing market-based solutions to improve access to health, education, water and sanitation, and livelihoods, unquote. It then authorizes $130 million per year for 2021 and 2022 for mostly State Department programs, with most of that money going towards assistance aimed at, quote, market-based solutions to address development challenges, unquote. So same different country. And this one, I think it's probably worth a full episode. I mean, I did Belarus. If I was going to do another country, it would absolutely be Sudan based on the attention it got in this NDAA. But I have to move on from this war stuff right now. But just know that I'm keeping an eye on Sudan, and you should too. I really wish I had unlimited time with both of these laws. I mean, like I said, I could do this all year. But yeah, so Sudan, put that on your radar. And then last, Latin America, specifically Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Here's Secretary of State Antony Blinken on March 10th.
We have to deal with the drivers of migration, to your point. And I think there is real opportunity there to do that. When President Biden was vice president, as you may remember, he led an effort, very successful effort, a bipartisan effort with Congress to secure significantly more resources to help Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador deal with some of these drivers, whether it came to security, whether it came to corruption, whether it came to economic opportunity. And we did this in a way that was simply not simply throwing money at the problem, but demanding concrete reforms from these countries that actually materially improved the situation for people there and took away some of the incentives for them to come to the United States. We now have a proposal with additional resources over 4 years to do that, and to do that in a, I think, potentially effective way.
And I have no idea what that proposal is. And so for the next main episode, I have to bang out the COVID law, the $1.9 trillion one, because that actually affects our day-to-day lives. But then I'm going to binge the shit out of at least a dozen hearings to try and find out what the Biden administration is up to. It's now April. They've got some plans, and I want to know what they are. And to do that, I'm definitely going to be trying to figure out what they want to do in our neighbors to the south. But the big picture, you know, no matter what country we're talking about, whether it be China or Russia or Belarus or Venezuela or Sudan or the Latin American countries, it doesn't matter. This is all a battle of economic systems. Here's Secretary of State Antony Blinken on March 10th.
When we see democracy being challenged by China or by Russia, one of the things that they're trying to do constantly is not just to divide us from other democracies, but of course to divide us from ourselves, and in particular to try to make the case that the system that we all believe in and are dedicating our lives to professionally doesn't work, and that their systems are better.
It's about the system, the economic system, the world trade system. And this is our top diplomat's advice for how he thinks we can get this system to win.
Demonstrate together that democracy actually delivers for our people and for other democracies. That is the single best answer and response to this effort by autocratic countries around the world to try to make the case that democracy doesn't deliver and autocracy does. So I hope we can work on that together, because that's the path to success.
You know, they say that the system they're promoting is based on democracy, and they always say human rights and rule of law. But they're labeling their economic system democracy. When you look at our democracy here at home, there's a lot that is not to be envied. You know, one of our two empowered political parties, the Republican Party, is using its power at the state level right now to make it harder for people to vote. In the last election, the leader of that party fought in every legal avenue available to him, to the point of having people storm the Capitol to have votes thrown away. He wanted just enough ballots tossed in the trash to flip the election to keep him in power. And there were a lot of people in that party that tried to help him do it. We also, as a system, as our democracy, allow private groups to create and enact the rules that narrow down our lists of candidates in primary elections. We allow the Democrats and Republicans to control who gets to the main ballots. We also allow voting to be conducted on machines with no paper trails. Our debates on the presidential level are conducted by corporate media who get to choose who gets to participate. And we allow political parties to draw congressional district boundaries, resulting in maps that we all know are rigged. Our democracy is a mess. And so if we actually stand for these things, if we actually stand for democracy, and personally I want to, we need to create an electoral system worth desiring here at home. Then when it comes to human rights, my God, Officer Derek Chauvin is on trial right now for sitting on a citizen's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds and not giving a damn on camera that he was clearly killing him. Far from a one-off situation in this country. Our police forces have been transferred weapons of war from our actual War Department that they use to police us on our streets. They have actual tanks, and they use them against us. We have the highest percentage of our civilian population being imprisoned in cages than any other country in the world. We also have a healthcare system where if you get sick, you can go bankrupt and die. Our healthcare system bankrupts people all the time. I mean, how many people do you know that have gotten sick that have ended up with a GoFundMe begging other citizens who are also paying taxes for the money that they need for their treatment because we don't provide that as a part of our taxpayer-provided societal infrastructure like most other countries in the world do. And let's also not forget that in my lifetime, we tortured people, and the whole world knows it. There are long reports created by our own Congress that confirm it. And the person ultimately responsible for the torture program's authorization, President George W. Bush, is happily painting strange pictures of his feet somewhere in Texas. That man was never held accountable. None of the authorizations in his administration have ever been held accountable. In fact, a lot of them got back into power when Trump was elected. And so if we really want to be believed as a country that stands for human rights, we need to act like it. We can't and won't be trusted as a leader in human rights when they are often violated here at home and in our names abroad. And then you want to talk about the rule of law in our economic system? Our bankers crashed the world's economy, and we used our taxes to pay their bad debts. We then allowed those same banks to consolidate and get even more powerful instead of revoking their corporate charters and prosecuting the executives. And the whole world knows that that happened. Is it any surprise that they don't trust us to operate the global economic system anymore? And so, yeah, China is challenging that system. And their system has problems of its own, obviously. I'm not saying that I want to live in a surveillance state like China is reported to have. And I don't know what the hell is going on with the Uyghurs. I'm sure there are human rights violations too. I'm not saying that their system is any better. But just like with all of my foreign policy focuses on this show, it's not about China. I can only control my own country. The United States is the only place where I get a vote. And this system, this is the one we're promoting. You know, this is the one that we are spending about $1 trillion a year to try and implement. You look at our enormous military budget, and so many people think it's bloated, but when you think about what they're actually trying to do, it's not defending the United States from possible attacks. That's not what our military is trying to do. Our military is trying to be the muscle to make the economic system governed by the World Trade Organization truly global. And if that's the goal, I agree that $1 trillion a year might not be enough. But a lot of Americans think that the military is just there to protect us, you know, like when we're in peacetime, which I don't know if we've been in peacetime in my entire life, to be honest about it. But the idea that a lot of Americans have about the military is that it's to defend the United States. But the mission has been expanded. It's to defend the World Trade System. And so that's why China is an enemy. That's why Russia is an enemy. They're challenging that system. But the problem is, so are a lot of us, including Americans, who are in this system, because this system isn't what it's branded to be. They keep calling it democracy, but a lot of people are dying, actually dying, to implement a system that doesn't feel democratic. I mean, the rules of the World Trade System are made by trade agreements that are negotiated behind closed doors, and we don't get a vote. So don't tell me that that's democracy. And when it comes to human rights and fairness and all that stuff, it's not what we say it is. And so we can continue to burn our tax money on military buildups and continue to command respect via fear. This could continue to work for decades. But this system's fatal flaw is its hypocrisy. No tank or battleship or space laser is going to change the fact that we don't stand for what we say we do in the world. As a country, we've been represented by the Republican and Democratic parties, and our actions haven't matched our words. And instead of dealing with that, they just keep investing our money in scaring the world into submission. Initiative after initiative, more pre-positioning for a world war. And when I look at the strategies being employed by these different systems, I wish we were the ones that were at least building things. I wish we weren't the ones using sanctions, which is starvation, and weapons and fear. I really do wish our system is what they say it is. I wish it were about democracy and fair rules and human rights. You know, human rights. Do you know that Moderna got at least $1 billion in our tax money last year to create their vaccine? Us U.S. taxpayers co-created the Moderna vaccine, which is extremely effective. At the highest price, that vaccine is $50 per person. So it would cost us $385 billion to vaccinate every single person in the world with the vaccine that we helped to create. And if we paid the U.S. rate, that's $15 per person. It would only cost us $116 billion to vaccinate the entire world with that vaccine that we paid to create. Our recent COVID law is said to cost $1.9 trillion. And I haven't read it yet, but that's the number that's everywhere. $1.9 trillion. We could have vaccinated the entire world with the vaccine we paid to invent with less than a quarter of that law. But did we choose to do that? No. In fact, we're using our power at the World Trade Organization to prevent other companies from making the same vaccine. We're protecting patents. We're protecting profits. I'm not proud of that. I'm not proud of our role in this system. And so as I sit here as the host of Congressional Dish and I look at this battle of the systems, first of all, I feel like this is a conversation that we're not having as a whole in the United States. When we talk about our military budget, we've never really had the conversation of, do we want to be the muscle for this system? You know, so that's one thing. But because I'm an American, because I have an American passport and I pay American taxes, it seems like I'm supposed to defend our system, especially when I'm talking about this system versus China's system. And the thing that devastates me when I do these types of episodes is that I can't defend the economic system. Now, I'll defend our Constitution all day. I love representative government. But the Republicans and Democrats, these two parties, have totally warped it. They've harnessed the power of our government for a global system, global economic system that serves the shareholder class, the wealthiest people in the world, that has devalued our work, our time, and our humanity. And so in this battle of global economic systems, much like every election battle between Republicans and Democrats, I feel like I don't have anyone to root for. But where I do have hope is that I hope we can use these communication tools that we have now to somehow elect a group of people sometime, hopefully soon, to our government who will for real start fixing that. That really will try to make a world based on democracy, rule of law, and human rights. And rule of law, you know, you can say rule of law, but it matters what the rules are and who writes them. I want these laws to be fair. I want these laws to be so good that other countries want to be a part of this system. I don't want to have to coerce other countries to do this, either with loan sharking them or bombing them. If our system is that good, then they'll want to be a part of it. And I want to actually stand for those things. I want fair elections. I don't want political parties in control of our elections. I don't want legalized bribery anymore. I want prison sentences for rich people who commit crimes. And I want a return on our tax investment that affords us freedom to fail, to get sick, to lose our jobs. I'm paying taxes to my country, but I don't get healthcare coverage. Eric, who just died of a 10-year battle with cancer, didn't have healthcare coverage, even though he paid into this system. Hundreds of thousands of dollars on top of his taxes he had to pay in that battle. It's not fair. We also don't get basic housing. We don't get college or reliable public transportation. We don't get the return on tax investments that other citizens of other countries do in a way that really improve our day-to-day lives and give us freedom to take risks. I have neighbors that live on the street. All of us in cities all over the United States We all have neighbors that live in the streets. We have humans living in doorways all over this country. That's a human rights violation, and we walk by it every day. Democracy, rule of law, human rights. I want to stand for those things. And when our actions match those words, that's when I'll defend this economic system. Maybe I'll get on board with the idea of spending $1 trillion a year to enact it. But right now, I just can't. So like I said in the beginning of the episode, Congressional Dish it's created by me, but it is produced by so many people. And I would like to announce that we do have a new executive producer. This is actually a longtime producer, and I'm so excited to be saying his name right now. But Joseph Clerici has contributed a cumulative $559.20 and counting via PayPal and Patreon over the course of many years. And he has chosen to become the executive producer of episode 156, which is actually a super relevant episode to be announcing on this episode because it was about sanctions that we placed in 2017 upon Russia, North Korea, and Iran. And in Joseph's note, he said, quote, I struggled with narrowing it down to one episode, but let's go with number 156. I remember listening to this one on a particularly memorable road trip when it came out, and I feel like most of the subject matter is still relevant today. Great use of hearing footage in this one and a great overview of current geopolitical flashpoints and your larger take on imperial strategy. Also, I've noticed that there has been more public debate in recent months on the topic of sanctions and their unintended consequences in recent years. So I feel like the information presented here is worth revisiting as a part of that discussion. Again, my condolences on your loss. Thank you. As someone with a couple people in my family fighting cancer, I'm so sorry. I know how horrible that is, Joseph. He said it was a hard but moving listen. I appreciate your willingness to share something so painful with all of us and your openness about how it's shaped your views on healthcare. I just gave a few bucks to the crowdfunding campaign. I wish I was in a position to be more generous. Thank you so much for doing that. And actually, I want to thank people in a main episode right now. I did notice a few of you guys' names on the GoFundMe for Eric, and that means a lot to me. So thank you so much for supporting my family. And just thank you. Thank you as always for supporting my work. I have a relationship with you guys as individuals. Like I said, this isn't a one-way thing. When I see your names pop up on something like that, just know that it means a lot to me. So thanks, Joe, for producing the show for as long as you have. I'm so proud to have your name alongside mine on one of the episodes, on episode 156. It's a great one to pick. To all the other producers, I will be doing a thank you episode next week. And of course, I'm going to talk about Matt Gaetz. I've been spending, one of the reasons that this episode's coming out a week later than I intended because I took my little nieces camping and I just kind of turned everything off for a few days. People keep asking me how I'm doing, and honestly, I'm not doing great with all of the, I don't know. As you can listen to the last thank you episode to find out why I've been kind of a mess, but I went camping for a few days. I'm feeling a little bit better. And so I've really checked out. And so I just checked my emails. I have 165 emails that I have to address. So that's a lot. And I also just have been checked out of the world. So I know a little bit of the Matt Gaetz stuff. I'm definitely going to dive into the story a little bit more because I love a good congressional scandal, and this one sounds juicy as hell. So thank you episode is coming up next week. I'll give you an update on what's going on with my personal stuff, but obviously I'll talk about Matt Gaetz. And of course, I'm going to read all the notes from all of the other producers. And I also right now want to tell you really quick before I wrap this up, I asked in the last thank you episode if you guys wanted me to split out the thank you episodes from the main Congressional Dish episodes. And the replies to that are all over the map. I'm even more confused now than I was before. So keep the feedback coming, because right now I'm going to say it's like a 50-50 split. And half the people are like, no, keep the thank you episodes in the Congressional Dish feed. And then the other half of people are like, I definitely want them switched. I've wanted them switched for a long time. So it's like, apparently it's a polarizing topic, and I need more people to let us know how you feel about that. So please keep that feedback coming, and I'll be reading some of that to you in the thank you episode as well. But again, if you support this work and want me to keep doing it, please pay for it using any of the options listed in this episode. Show notes, Patreon, PayPal, Venmo, Zelle, paper checks, whatever works for you works for me. And you should pay whatever amount represents the value you receive from this podcast. And thanks so much. And I hope your families are healthy and happy. And I will talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.
We're surrounded now by
don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, in the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.